Welcome to the Right News Network.
Welcome to your World News Update. I'm Emma Hurt, bringing you today's top stories from around the globe. The Trump administration is turning up the heat on Iran, warning the country to get smart soon or face the consequences. New U.S.-Israeli combat operations and an expanding blockade on Iranian ports have already pushed oil prices above $114 a barrel. Watch for whether Iran signals any willingness to return to nuclear negotiations in the coming weeks. Remaining with world affairs, the Trump administration is facing a high-stakes choice over Iran's latest proposal that could reshape oil markets and regional security. Our Middle East correspondent Layla Nazari has this. Layla?
Well, Emma, what we're seeing right now is Iran essentially offering a deal in two parts. They're willing to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which is obviously the world's most critical oil choke point, but they want to push nuclear talks down the road. The administration, though, doesn't seem very interested in that arrangement. In fact, Trump's team is actually preparing for a longer U.S. naval blockade instead.
So what does that mean for oil prices and everyday Americans?
Look, it's already happening. Prices are climbing as markets worry about sustained closure. The Strait handles about a third of global seaborne oil, so any extended blockade hits everybody's wallet. And honestly, what's interesting is that Iran's trying to split the difference here. Give on one thing, get breathing room on another, but the Trump administration seems intent on maximum pressure rather than any partial wins.
Layla, appreciate it. Still on world affairs, the death toll keeps rising across multiple conflict zones, and it's raising serious questions about whether these ceasefires can actually hold. Layla, you are still here. What is the latest from the ground?
Well, Emma, what we're seeing is pretty troubling. 8 people killed in southern Lebanon, including 3 rescue workers. And then in Gaza, at least 5 more deaths just in the last 24 hours, including a 9-year-old child. So despite these ceasefire agreements that are supposed to be in place, Israeli military operations are continuing, and they're justifying it by saying they're going after Hezbollah infrastructure and weapons caches.
Are these strikes being treated as violations of the ceasefire? Or is there some gray area in how the agreements are actually written?
Look, that's exactly the problem. There's a lot of ambiguity here. Israel says they're targeting militant positions and tunnels, which they claim are embedded in civilian areas. But Lebanese and Palestinian authorities are saying these are clear violations of what should be protected zones. The real issue is that nobody's enforcing these agreements, and without teeth behind a ceasefire, you're basically left with two sides operating under completely different interpretations of what's actually allowed.
Layla, appreciate the clarity on this. The United Arab Emirates is leaving OPEC after more than 60 years as a member of the world's most powerful oil cartel, a move that could reshape global energy markets. The departure signals growing tensions within the organization over production quotas and pricing control. Watch how other major oil producers respond to the UAE's exit in the coming months. Also on the world front, the Supreme Court is weighing whether the Trump administration can revoke temporary protected status for roughly 600,000 Haitians and Syrians who are currently authorized to work in the United States. The case, argued Wednesday, threatens to upend the lives of hundreds of thousands of immigrants while testing presidential power over immigration policy. Watch for a ruling before June that could reshape how America handles temporary humanitarian protections. The Federal Reserve is expected to hold interest rates steady this week, at what's likely Jerome Powell's final meeting as chair, a significant moment as the central bank prepares for major leadership change. Our finance editor, Sophia Reeves, has this. Sophia?
Well, Emma, that's right. So the Fed's meeting wraps up this week, and they're expected to keep rates exactly where they are right now. What's interesting is this is almost certainly Jerome Powell's last major decision as Fed chair. He's been leading the Fed since 2018, and he's about to hand things over to Kevin Warsh. So we're looking at a real transition moment here.
How does this leadership change actually affect everyday Americans?
Look, the Fed basically controls interest rates that trickle down to everything: your mortgage, your car loan, your credit card. So when you change chairs, there's always this question mark about what comes next. Powell's been pretty methodical, cautious. Warsh has got a different background, different philosophy potentially, and nobody really knows yet if he's going to take the Fed in a different direction on inflation, on employment, all that stuff.
Sophia, appreciate it. A major conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran is now disrupting the delivery of food, medicine, and fuel to millions of people worldwide. The European Commission is calling for immediate diplomacy to end the war and reopen vital shipping routes through the Strait of Hormuz. Aid organizations say a humanitarian corridor is urgently needed to prevent further suffering. Republicans are divided on two major issues facing Congress right now: how to end a record DHS shutdown and whether to fund a controversial White House ballroom project. Our Washington correspondent Marcus Webb has more. Marcus?
Well, Emma, what we're seeing right now is Speaker Johnson trying to juggle two really messy situations at once. On one hand, there's this ongoing DHS shutdown, the longest one on record, and Johnson's demanding changes to a Senate bill that's supposed to end it. At the same time, Republicans are pushing back hard on Trump's plan to build a 90,000-square-foot ballroom at the White House.
Why are Senate Republicans so opposed to the ballroom project?
Look, here's the thing. A lot of GOP senators are worried this is just bad politics right now. If it requires taxpayer funding, which some estimates suggest it would, it makes Republicans look tone-deaf when they're supposed to be the party of fiscal responsibility. I mean, you've got a government shutdown happening, and Trump wants to spend millions on a new ballroom. It's not a great look.
So where does this leave Speaker Johnson?
Thank you, Marcus.
The Middle East conflict is hitting your wallet at the airport. Airlines worldwide are canceling flights and raising fares as jet fuel prices spike following the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, a critical shipping route that supplies global oil markets. While U.S. carriers continue selling tickets despite price hikes, European low-cost airlines are cutting routes entirely, and industry experts warn elevated costs could persist for months to years. Moving to the Middle East now, where escalating military operations in the occupied West Bank are raising tensions between Israeli forces and Palestinian militant groups. The Israeli Defense Forces arrested a senior commander of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad's Jenin battalion during a raid, though 2 Israeli soldiers were wounded in separate clashes. Watch for potential Palestinian retaliation and further Israeli security operations in the region. The headlines tell you what happened. Our analysis tells you why it matters and what comes next. King Charles III has just completed one of the most watched and arguably most consequential state visits to Washington in a generation. Addressing Congress, dining with Trump at the White House, and delivering jokes sharp enough to cut through the diplomatic formality of a room full of senators and representatives. But beneath the wit and the pageantry, there were serious signals being sent about Iran, about the future of the special relationship, and about where Western power is actually headed. Joining me now are Marcus Webb, our defense and security analyst, and Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor. Marcus, let me start with you. Was this visit more than theater? Or is the special relationship still running on nostalgia and goodwill rather than genuine strategic substance?
Thanks, Emma. Look, I'll tell you what this visit was. It was a reminder that when two nations with genuine civilizational roots and genuine strategic interests get in the same room, the results are completely different from the performative multilateralism we get at the G7 or the UN. Charles addressed a joint session of Congress. He talked about the alliance as one of the most consequential in human history, and he's right. This isn't sentiment, this is the backbone of Western security. What I found most revealing was Trump raising Iran at the state dinner toast. You don't do that by accident. That was a signal to Tehran, to NATO allies, to anyone watching, that the two most powerful English-speaking nations on Earth are aligned on the most dangerous nuclear proliferation question of our time. Douglas Murray has been saying for years that the West needs to defend its interests with confidence rather than apology, and that's exactly what we saw in Washington this week. My only concern, and I'll come back to this, is whether private alignment translates into public policy before Iran's window closes.
But Marcus, isn't there a risk that you're reading too much into what was, frankly, a heavily choreographed piece of royal diplomacy? The king cracked jokes about speaking French, he gave Trump a bell with a pun about giving us a ring. This could just as easily be very expensive, very well-produced, soft power, with no hard strategic follow-through whatsoever. And Sophia, what's your take on this? Particularly from an economic angle, because a US-UK trade deal has been imminent for about 9 years now?
Well, look, Marcus isn't wrong about the symbolism mattering, but here's what I think Marcus is missing. Symbolism without a trade deal is just very expensive theater. And I mean that seriously. The bilateral trading relationship between the US and the UK runs into hundreds of billions annually. They are each other's largest foreign investors, and yet we still don't have a comprehensive free trade agreement. Post-Brexit, Britain was supposed to unlock exactly this. Nigel Farage built a significant part of his political career on the promise that leaving the EU meant Britain could finally sign the big Anglosphere deals. And yet here we are. Charles is making jokes in the White House, and the trade deal is still sitting in procedural purgatory. If this visit doesn't produce serious movement on a US-UK FTA, then I'd argue the strategic substance Marcus is pointing to is running on borrowed credibility.
I hear what Sophia is saying, but with respect, that misses the point entirely on the security dimension. You cannot reduce the special relationship to a trade deal timeline. Iran has a nuclear program. That is the conversation that matters right now. Trump publicly stated that Charles agreed with his position on Tehran's weapons capability. Whether or not Sophia gets her free trade framework, the question of whether a nuclear-armed Iran destabilizes the entire Middle East and triggers a proliferation cascade across Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey, that is what keeps people in the intelligence community awake at night. And if Britain is not locked in, publicly and unambiguously, as an American partner on that question before the window closes, then no amount of trade agreements will matter because the region will be unrecognizable.
Here's what I want to know, and this is the question I don't think anyone in the mainstream media is asking loudly enough. In 6 months' time, is the special relationship measurably stronger, or does this go down as another beautifully catered dinner that produced nothing you could point to on a map? Sophia, where do you see this going?
The way I see this playing out, there are really two tracks running simultaneously. On the economic track, if the Trump administration is serious about rewarding allies, and Trump has shown he responds to personal relationships in a way that career diplomats don't always understand, then Charles's obvious chemistry with Trump could actually move the needle on trade in a way that years of formal negotiation haven't. The data supports this being a real opportunity, but if the Starmer government in London fumbles the follow-through, and let's be honest, Keir Starmer's instincts are not exactly Thatcherite, then this warm glow fades by autumn, and we're back to square one. The trajectory suggests the opportunity is real, but the political will on the British side is the weakest link.
Here's what concerns me most, and this is the Falklands angle that National Review has raised and almost nobody else is covering. Trump has been publicly unpredictable on territorial questions. Greenland, Panama, Canada. He has not given Britain an unambiguous, on-the-record commitment to Falklands sovereignty. Buenos Aires is watching every single exchange from this visit and measuring every silence. If this trip did not produce that explicit commitment, then the risk is that Argentine diplomatic pressure intensifies in the second half of 2025, and Britain finds itself in the extraordinary position of having just had the warmest US-UK summit in years, while simultaneously being exposed on its southern flank. History tells us that vacuums in American commitment get filled, and not by friendly parties.
Remarkable analysis from both of you, and one thing is absolutely certain tonight. Somewhere in Tehran and somewhere in Buenos Aires, someone just watched every second of that state dinner very, very carefully, and they're not smiling about what they saw. We are living through what may be the most politically volatile week in recent American history. A sixth assassination attempt on a sitting president, a twice-indicted former FBI director claiming a seashell arrangement was pure coincidence, and the Democratic Party hiding its own post-election autopsy from the very people who funded it. The institutions that are supposed to hold this country together are fracturing in real time, and the question is whether anyone in Washington has the courage to say so out loud. Joining me now are Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor, and James Chen, our geopolitical analyst. Sophia, let me start with you. Is the Democratic Party's refusal to release this autopsy evidence of a party that simply cannot face the truth about itself?
Thanks, Emma. And yes, absolutely, unambiguously yes. Look, this is a party that raised over $1 billion in 2024, lost the presidency, lost the Senate, and couldn't retake the House. They're not a messaging problem. That is not a candidate problem. That is a fundamental ideological rupture between the Democratic Party's leadership class and the actual voters they claim to represent. The fact that DNC Chairman Ken Martin initially promised transparency and then quietly buried this report in December 2025 tells you everything. They know what's in it. They know it says, stop chasing progressive ideological purity. Stop treating working-class Americans like they're morally deficient for having traditional values. Stop the identity politics obsession. And they simply cannot bring themselves to do it. Ben Shapiro has been saying for years that the Democrats have become a party of the credentialed elite, utterly disconnected from the people they once claimed to champion. This buried autopsy is the proof. And frankly, the assassination attempt culture that has developed around Trump is the other side of the same coin. When you convince your base that the opposition is literally fascist, you should not be surprised by what follows.
But Sophia, devil's advocate here, isn't every political party entitled to keep its internal strategic review private? The Republicans have done exactly the same after previous defeats. And on the assassination attempt, are we really drawing a direct line between political rhetoric and individual violent acts? James, what's your take on this?
Well, look, Sophia's making important points, but I think she's conflating two separate issues in a way that muddies the analysis. On the autopsy, yes, it's politically embarrassing that it's being suppressed, but the real story here is the Comey indictment. And that story is fundamentally about institutional accountability, not culture war. Here's what matters. James Comey ran the FBI. He had access to the most sensitive intelligence in the world. He then posts, or claims to stumble across, a seashell arrangement reading 8647, which is unambiguously interpreted as a call to eliminate the 47th president. And his defense is essentially, I didn't mean it. The DOJ indicted him twice. That tells you the evidence is serious and specific. The data on political violence is also damning. ACLED documented a 300% increase in political violence incidents between 2016 and 2020. 300%. That didn't happen in a vacuum. That happened in a media environment where every major network was describing Trump as an existential threat to democracy every single night.
I hear what James is saying, but with respect, separating the Comey story from the broader cultural context completely misses the point. Look, 6 assassination attempts. 6. No modern president in American history has faced that. And every single time the mainstream media coverage lasts 48 hours, and then they pivot back to complaining about Trump's tone. The asymmetry is breathtaking. If a Republican pastor had stood up the morning after an attempt on a Democratic president and compared the other side to Confederates, every network in America would run it wall to wall for a week. Instead, Reverend Rigby does exactly that, and it gets buried. This is not a coincidence. This is a media ecosystem that has decided one side of American politics is legitimate and the other is not. And when you delegitimize tens of millions of people, you license extremism against them. Douglas Murray has made this argument with devastating precision. You cannot call someone a fascist for 4 years and then act surprised when someone decides fascists deserve to be stopped by any means necessary.
Here's what I want to know, and I want both of you on this. Where does this actually end? The Comey indictment, the suppressed autopsy, the escalating political temperature. James, where do you see this going over the next 6 months?
The way I see this playing out, there are really two possible paths. The first is that the Comey prosecution is seen by the left as pure political retribution. And if that happens, the rhetoric escalates further, not less. The second path, which I genuinely think is possible, is that consistent institutional accountability, prosecuting people regardless of their political connections, actually begins to restore some credibility to the justice system. The risk is that it's very hard to do the second thing without it looking like the first, particularly in a media environment that will frame every prosecution of a Democrat as fascism. The suppressed autopsy is the wild card. That document is going to leak, and when it does, it could trigger the internal Democratic civil war that the party leadership has been desperately trying to prevent before the 2026 midterms.
Here's what concerns me most, and I think this is the scenario nobody wants to discuss. If the trajectory of political violence continues, if we get to a 7th or 8th attempt, and if the rhetoric from the institutional left continues to provide the cultural oxygen for it, we are not just talking about political dysfunction. We are talking about a genuine crisis of democratic legitimacy. History tells us that democracies don't usually collapse from a single dramatic moment. They erode increment by increment until the institutions that are supposed to hold everything together simply stop being trusted by enough people to function. The DNC hiding its autopsy, Comey posting what he posted, a pastor using an assassination attempt as a sermon prop. These are individually manageable. Together, they are a picture of an institution in advanced decay. And the risk is that by the time everyone agrees something must be done, it's already too late.
Sophia Reeves, James Chen, two sharp minds, not entirely in agreement, both worried about where this is going. One thing is certain. Somewhere in Washington tonight, there's a very thick document in a very locked drawer, and the people who wrote it are not sleeping well. That's all for this update. Stay informed and stay connected. I'm Emma Hurt. We'll be back shortly.